And we'll take it away. So I know a lot of you teach about homeostasis and endocrine, and this is like it's not the easiest topic for us to teach during our classes. And I'm hoping that this will give you some just different ideas, things that you can do in your class. And by the way, a lot of these are not limited to homeostasis. They're things that you could do in any classroom or on any material. So there we go. So one of the things that I want to start with is really what do we want the students to learn? So what are your learning goals when you teach about homeostasis and endocrine? And I believe Courtney is going to drop this link in the chat. And what you can do is it's going to be a whiteboard with post-its on it. You're going to double click on those post-its and you can write in your learning outcomes. Duplicates are totally fine. And what I can do is actually bring this over so we can see these answers as they start to come in. And by the way, this is one of these things that you can do in your classroom, and you can also do it for a variety of topics. Work. There we go. Haha. Now I've got my post-it board. All right, I'm seeing people moving around the board. So yeah, you just double click on one of those post-its and then you should be able to move them around. And oh, you know what? Here, let me help you out here. I see what's going on. Ha ha. All right. And hopefully, yep, cell structure and function, that's definitely one. By the way, totally okay to zoom in on these as you're making them because it can get a little bit different. Positive versus negative feedback. Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. That's a tough one, right? There we go. And there are, if you're struggling with the sticky notes, what you can do is you can actually go over here at elements and you can make your own sticky note, and that's totally fine too. Yeah, the importance of homeostasis, absolutely, and the problems associated with it. This is one of the big things. So I just did, I went to a conference and I was talking about sort of teaching homeostasis and talking about the number of physiological, like the maladies that are, basically any illness, right? Is your body's out of homeostasis. And so we were kind of talking about that and saying, well, this is really important. And here it is. It's something that's just really hard to teach. And we know from the literature, it's really hard for the students to understand too. And don't feel afraid to put in some endocrine things too, because we're going to kind of put those two together. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. Oh, yeah. Blood calcium regulation. That's a good one. All right. One thing we can do. Oh, I've got this one, the various actions of hormones and their contributions in homeostasis, and I'm going to free up. Now we can sort these. If you scroll down a little bit, we can sort these into, is it about homeostasis? Is it about endocrine, or is it both? And you can move both your own post-its, you can move other people's post-its too. And this is something, right now, of course, we're doing this digitally. In your classroom, you could do this with note cards, you can do it with post-its. It's a good way to get students to organize thoughts. I actually use this sort of thing a lot for homeostasis because a lot of the mechanisms have many steps, and then you can give them the cards and say, put the steps in order, right? Or I use it for synaptic transmission, like what are the steps in synaptic transmission or muscle contraction? So this is what we would call a card sorting task. And those card sorting tasks are um, kind of one of those ways that we can get students to think about how things fit together. All right, that one's in the back. I'm just putting these little boxes in the back. There we go. Okay. So I'm seeing a bunch of these. These are exciting. And I'm seeing that this one doesn't want to cooperate. It just keeps wanting to sit in the back. That's okay. All right. Um, there we go. We can bring this hormones and their contribution. Ooh, alterations in homeostasis, the big picture. We'll put that under homeostasis. So you kind of get an idea of how this is working. And we'll come back to this. So if you want to keep adding more in, that's totally fine. But I think I've got a set of things that we're interested in, and then we can go from there. All right. So what I want to do now is I kind of want to ground us in a homeostatic function. And of course, there are a lot of these that we can do. We're going to do another quick activity. Again, this is something you can do in your course. And in this case, we're going to take you to a slightly different page. Here, you are going to enter your heart rate data. Now, this is a good time you can teach students how to take their pulse, or if you're like me and you want to cheat and you've got your Apple Watch, you can just say where you're rocking. And don't worry, we're not going to judge based on if you're hopped up on caffeine and your number is a little higher than normal. You're just going to enter your numbers right here under heart rate. All right. There we go. And as you enter those in, those should pop up and it's going to make a nice little graph. All right, and we'll keep on going here. But one thing that I usually ask my students before we do something like this is I'll say, what's the normal heart rate? And they always pair it back, whatever value they're taught, right? 70 beats per minute. Or if you do body temperature, 98.6, right? They always sort of pair it back those stereotypical answers. And it's nice to actually get really real data. So if a student said 70 beats per minute, and then we said, okay, everybody take your heart rate. I want you all to notice something. None of you are at 70 beats per minute, okay? But when we look at it, and we look at sort of the range of data, we're seeing that, it's in the 70s. It's sort of in that area, right? And if we were to look at this and say, are any of these like really weird outliers? Are they things we've never seen before? We would say no, right? And usually if you do something like this and your class is big enough, the average ends up being about 70. So that's kind of a fun thing too. All right, let's get back to my slides. Oh, and now I'm back here again. Don't mind me. It's okay. We've all been there. There we go. All right. So this really allows us to have that conversation of, all right, I'm having technical difficulties, don't mind me. This allows that conversation of that homeostasis is a range, right? And we can say, hey, there's not just one normal. No one's outside of the norm, but it's now we've got this range of variables and the range is normal. One thing we can do with our students, and again, you could do it here. We do have a thing in your take-home kit that's really good for this. Have them move around for like 2 minutes and take their heart rate again and see if it changed. And if it did change, is it higher or lower, right? We know as professors it's going to be higher, but then we can actually talk to them and say, well, why is it higher? Like, why do you think your heart needs to beat more? And why is it, how is it adapting? So this is a nice way to kind of introduce that concept. And then the cool thing is, once they're sitting for a while, that heart rate's going to go back down. And so you can show what we would say is a change in the set point, right? You can show that that heart rate is going to change based on the needs of the body. Heart rate's really easy. The funny thing about this is that until I got ready to speak to y'all, I used to do this with blood sugar and have my students like prick their finger, which they hated and it was traumatic. But at the same time, it gave them that same sense of the homeostatic norms and they always got it. And then, of course, now I realize there are non-invasive ways to do this. And you could do it multiple times through the semester working on different systems. So then we might bring our students back and we might say, hey, how do we define homeostasis? So why don't you guys pop into the chat different ways that you might define homeostasis? Don't be shy. Ooh, dynamic balance. I love that. That's good. Yep. Body and balance, a range of values that permits function. Really good. Maintaining stability despite external changes. Yes. Yep. So one thing we could do with all of your answers is we could take those and then start to create either a word cloud or a collective understanding of what homeostasis is, right? So there's sort of different aspects of this, right? One person mentioned, hey, as external conditions are changing, the internal is adapting. And then we've got a lot of them that are like, it's a stable state, it's a state of balance, it's a range of balance. And that's coming in here. We might create some sort of mutual definition. And this is, again, it's an activity. Is it going to take some time in your class? Absolutely. Are your students going to understand it? Yes, because they're going to be in on this conversation of what homeostasis is. Okay, now that we're through that, and a little shout out here to my friend, the beating heart. This is one of my favorite visible body models. Um, and it's usable for or useful for a bunch of things. I'm going to get to feedback loops. And I know that was one of the things that you put on that whiteboard with the sticky notes. This is traditionally what we think of when we look at a feedback loop, right? We think that there's a stimulus and that's sensed by a sensor, and then that information goes into a control center, and then the effector figures out, or the effector does the thing. And usually you would use some kind of example of like a furnace in here. And that's all well and good. And the interesting thing is that this sort of way of thinking of homeostasis really comes to us from like engineering, like control theory. Like it comes to us not from biology. We just kind of adapted it because we as biologists love to adapt things. But when we look at this and we think about it, I want you to think about what this looks like to your students. And I think that there's some problems that come forward. There are a lot of new words here. You get stimulus center, control center, or sensor, control center, effector. These are a lot of different terms. Now I have to figure out what they mean and how they relate to each other and put them in my own sort of lexicon. The words vary. So sometimes we say receptor, sometimes we say sensor, sometimes we say stimulus, sometimes we say variable, and that depends on the text that the student is looking at. And it can be really hard. I don't know if other folks have tried this, but if you try to have your students map a homeostatic function onto this, inevitably they really struggle because it's hard for them to determine what the different parts are. And so I'm not 100% convinced this is the best way for us to discuss this. One example that I came up with having dealt with my students is they'll talk about, well, is the organ the effector? Is the effector the hormone? Is it the thing the hormone does? And I think that we get more questions than answers when we present it in this way. Plus, this doesn't work for multi-step processes. So if we're talking about, that anything occurring on the hypothalamic pituitary axis, it's going to be really kind of weird to think of those multi-step processes or the renin-angiotensin system if we do this. It's got more steps. So I want us to take a minute and I want us to rethink how we approach this and rethink what we want the students to get. And one of the things that I tend to do with my students is I tend to talk to them and say, what is feedback? And I've had this weird experience. I'm starting to get convinced that there's like an academic paper in it. But I'll talk to my students about what is feedback, and my A and B students will say, oh, it's a response to something you did. And I say, okay, great. So what if that doesn't match what you think you're doing? And then they say, oh, I study harder for the professor. And this is always coming from the A's and B's. My C and D students are like, I get mad. And I feel like that there's something in there. At the very least, a need to teach our students the role of feedback in life as well as biology, right? So if feedback is a reaction to something that happened, what if we think about homeostatic feedback loops not as this stimulus sensor effector? And you can still think about it that way, and you can still do it that way, no shade. But what if we simplify it and we think about a change that has occurred, and we can even think about a change that is sensed, right? We can go there as well, and a response to that change, and then add to it, how does this address the change? Like, what is the response doing to the change? Okay. So one thing you can do, and you can do this the old way too, is you can have each group get a hormone and fill in the boxes. You could do the same thing if you teach the sensor receptor, da 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 da. All right. Each group gets a hormone, they fill in the boxes, and then what we can do at the end is have like a little gallery walk where we're walking around the room and we're looking at what each group has come up with. And we can look at a lot of different loops this way. You could even assign deliberately like ones that work in whichever system you use. One of the things that we've added is we've added this, or one of the things we're going to give you, sorry, is this handout. And this handout is sort of a way to think about this. So you could have the change sensed as a decrease in blood glucose. The response, pancreas is going to release glucagon, and that's going to increase the blood glucose by releasing glycogen. And then you can say, is it positive or negative? We haven't gotten there yet. And talk about involved organs. So you have an example of this way of thinking. I realize it's a change from the norm, but at the same time, I think that at least when I think of especially my anatomy and physiology students, really I want to think of it more as a call and answer function. What is the hormone? Why is it being released? And what is the problem it's answering? All right, so there are a couple different assets that you could use here to help students kind of orient to this way. There's a video about vasopressin and what that's used for in the kidney. There's a blood glucose. It's an image, and it kind of shows both sides, the increase and the decrease. And there's an interactive about type 1 diabetes. All right. So now we can level this activity up, right? So before we kind of had each student or each group of students sort of take one hormone and run with it. Now what we can do is we can have each group get an organ. And one of the cool things that you can do in your app is that you can actually generate a QR code with your organ, and then you can put the QR codes on the different tables in your classroom, and your students will scan the QR code and figure out what organ they're assigned. This may not be super self-explanatory, right? When you look at this adrenal gland, if you're an A and P student, you might not be like, hey, that's an adrenal gland. You may be like, what is this thing? It's, it's not a kidney, right? And you may have to take that minute to figure out what it is. And that's a valuable thing that's going on in your brain, right? You're having that inquiry moment. So you'd put a QR code on each table, and then you could assign each group to introduce their organ, where it is, and what are the hormones it releases, and like what do those do in a very basic way. Oh, so there's a question in the chat about the QR code. Yes, it is going to take them I don't know about when you do LMS integration because my university won't let me do that. But when I do it on my devices, it logs me straight into the device. So certainly, if your student's working from their phone, I believe it would log them straight into VB Suite on their phone, and it takes them like right to the image. So this is like one of the ways that you could do this. And the fun thing about this is that the students don't know before they have to pick which organ they're going to get. So it could lead to them maybe exploring something that they don't know. All right. And then we can go like one step past, and there's a link to play with this one in the chat again. This is like one step beyond that. So now each group is going to do one of the following. They're going to, you've got your QR codes on the table. Your group is either going to name the organ, indicate the location of the organ, name the hormone it releases, what the hormone does, or correct another group's mistake. And you can literally have your students sort of lined up going through and doing this rapid fire. And you can even make it like, hey, once every answer on the table is right, I'm going to put, a little sign on there, and then you can't do that one anymore. And we're going to go until everybody gets everything right. This is a way to get them engaged. It's also a way to figure out where is the confusion. So if we go to the endocrine relay that has been posted in the chat, now we can do this, right? So let's go name the organ. And don't be shy here, folks. There are no wrong answers. And remember that one of the things you can do is correct a mistake, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to go thyroid. Ooh, I'm even going to spell it wrong. There we go. We're going for authentic anatomy and physiology experience. All right. And the sad thing is, if you think it is the thyroid, then you're going to go down a very different rabbit hole, right? Um, oh man, Jen, you're harshing my mellow. Jen fixed my mistake. So you can kind of get this idea of like, let's make it fun, let's make it interactive, and let's sort of pull different expertises from different students, right? Oh, awesome. Amy got in there with cortisol. And one of the neat things that we can do in this particular app is we can uh, talk about the things, whatever is coming from the hormone, and we can actually link these together. As we're doing this app, you could have your students do it with, they can put notes on a piece of string, or they can use pieces of string, they can use other things to kind of link these ideas together. If you're using Post-its, have them put them on a whiteboard, and then they can draw how they link. And even if they're like, yep, this is wrong, they can like pull something that's wrong out and be like, yeah, it was a mistake. And put that over in the mistake bin. And that's okay too, right? We learn through mistakes. Yeah, we've got adrenaline. See, this is the fun thing about the adrenal glands is that you've got so many different hormones. And I love that Amy's in here writing stress hormone. Yes. And what you could do is ask them at the end, how are these things linked? And you could have them say, well, cortisol and adrenaline are going to be released with stress. And then maybe talk about like why are those released together. So it's just a way to kick off discussion and kind of get you out of like PowerPoint lecture mode and more into let's talk about things. And let's kind of start from what you know and add a little bit more and make it more of a conversation. All right, you folks like the whiteboard. This is great. It is kind of fun. So if you're curious, this is just Canva, but there are a lot of different programs that will do the same thing. And many of them are free. And then there's some that you probably have access through your campus to do. All right. So that's your endocrine relay. So we just worked on the adrenal gland, but you can imagine you could do a bunch of different glands at the same time. And again, just to introduce this concept, you could also introduce the endocrine relay as something, okay, we're going to do this with the organs that are in this system. And as you go system by system, you could be like, let's do digestive. And you could do only those sort of digestive hormones, or, I mean, homeostasis isn't just hormones. So we could even say something more broad. And by the way, that's one thing I like about this mechanism of talking about homeostasis is that it's not hormone limited. All right. So one thing to know, and I'm going to take you through, Visible Body has a flashcard function, and it's actually can do a lot more than you're probably thinking about. One of the functions that, oh, sorry, I just got distracted by something shiny. This is what I do. Carrie had a point. She said, we have whiteboards in our labs. I can see putting the QR code in the middle and having people write around it. Yes, absolutely. And then your students are up and they're moving and they're having a good time. One thing you could even do is you could say, each student, maybe we've got a room full of organs, right? Each student gets 5 cards and they have to use all 5 of their cards and correctly, right? So if you can't just go through and make stupid mistakes. Maybe you have to do all 5 correctly, but if you do all 5 correctly, now you're going to get, an extra credit point, or you could use it like a lab practical if you wanted to, right? All right. So Visible Body also has flashcards, and these flashcards are really cool. It turns out there's already an endocrine set, and you can actually edit these decks. And one of the things I've been thinking about, um, and I'll show you really quick this endocrine flashcard deck. I've got a link for it, but it's one of those downloadables from the website that you can use. Um, and it's literally just, name that organ, right? So pretty easy peasy. But one thing that you could do with this is you could actually change it, and your class could create a collaborative deck. And you could do that using the information from the previous 2 activities. So maybe I'm writing a question on it, and I have to think of like what question would be answered this way. So what changes do hormones released from these organs respond to? And then as you flip it, it's actually going to start to tell you, oh, there's response to stress or salt balance. You can get these shared to you via QR codes from each of your students, and then you can create a giant collaborative deck that your students could actually use in order to study, in order to do a number of things. You'll have to excuse me, I added just random names as I was playing with this, but it's pretty easy to combine those cards as they're shared with you, and then you can use them. Oh, it can't be opened. But you can use
Sorry, I
it.
just wanted to jump in real quick. So if you are trying to access the flashcard deck on a browser, you will need a VB Suite account or a courseware account, um, and you'll have to paste the link in the app. Just clicking it on a browser isn't going to work. There is a share link function or a kind of button in the bottom menu of the of VB Suite. You can paste the link in there and it'll launch the app. If you are using VB Suite on a mobile phone, then you can just click the link and it will launch the deck.
So that's a way to like create a collaborative deck that your students could work from. Um, you could even have, each student send you one thing about each organ. And I actually like having my students answer questions or ask questions because it puts them in my seat of what is the question that would give you this answer. And it kind of helps reinforce test taking skills. All right. So then I started thinking, like, what can we do with the flashcards that goes beyond like flashcards? Because I don't know about y'all, but a lot of times when I talk to my students, I'm like, don't use flashcards. And it's because there's that memorization component, or I'll say if you have to split them into two decks and then compare the items or something like that. But these are different. And these are different because they can share them with you and you can use them as an interactive on their own. So one of the thoughts that I had is, what if you used your flashcards as like a way of the students giving you a muddiest point, or meaning the thing that they do not understand? And then you could organize them and answer them either at the end of that lesson or at the beginning of the next one as a review. So my example here is a student saying, I know that the pineal is melatonin, but like, when does it release it? Um, and they may say, why is it important or whatever? And then now you know, okay, next time I need to answer this. And by the way, this would work with any of the assets. So it's not limited to endocrine homeostasis, even though that's kind of what we're focused on today. So I think that that could be a really fun way to either end your lecture, run a review session, or start the next session, is be like, hey, these are the questions I got through your flashcard decks. And now, you can call on students to answer them, or you could answer them. All right. Moving on from the flashcard function, which by the way, you can even draw on the flashcards. So you could draw a pathway between organs and be like, what hormone does this? And now they have to think about that and can even annotate it on their own flashcards. So I wanted to get us to one of the things that's really difficult, which is that discussion of positive and negative feedback. And I pulled some stuff from OpenStax. No shade to OpenStax. I actually adore OpenStax, but I think that this is indicative of part of the problem, and it's something you see in a lot of textbooks. It's just OpenStax is free, so I used it. So we've got our negative feedback loop over here, and I've got my positive feedback loop over here. If I am a very novice student, I'm looking at these two loops. I'm seeing arrows that go in a circle, and they don't look different to me because I'm not understanding, right? And one of the problems that also happens is that you'll notice this one is increased heat loss. And so the negative feedback is making the variable more negative, and the positive feedback is making the variable more positive. Well, now this is reinforcing one of the misunderstandings our students often have, right? That is, negative feedback makes things go down and positive makes it go up. Oh, that's troublesome, right? So what we can do is, one of the assets that they have is they actually have a video, and I even put the audio in, about negative
The
feedback.
hormone levels that regulate many bodily processes are controlled through positive and negative feedback loops. Negative feedback loops, the more common of the two, work to maintain homeostasis by regulating hormone levels. Complex negative feedback loops involve the hypothalamus and pituitary. If the hypothalamus senses sufficient of thyroid hormones in the blood, this negative feedback will stop it from secreting thyrotropin-releasing hormone. If thyroid hormone levels drop, the hypothalamus will secrete thyrotropin-releasing hormone, causing the anterior pituitary to release thyroid-stimulating hormone. In simple negative feedback loops, the gland that produces the hormone receives feedback directly to inhibit or enable further hormone secretion.
All right, so that's the negative feedback one. They have one for positive feedback as well. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to show you the whole video, but what you could do,
The hormone level.
all right, we're going to skip this because we're smart, but spoiler alert, it's childbirth. Um, so what you can do is you can actually have the students map it on here. And the nice thing about this model is that they figure out that if the change increases, so the difference from normal increases, then it's positive feedback. And if the change decreases, it's negative feedback. And they'll start to figure out negative feedback is balance, and positive feedback is the opposite of balance, right? So it's kind of nice to do that. And this is something you could have them assigned to watch before they get to class. And then you could do an activity in class, or I'll admit sometimes, because my class is really early in the morning, I'll put the video on because it's a minute and that allows me to take a couple sips of coffee to wake myself up a little bit while my students are working. So once your students are kind of grounded in this positive and negative feedback, what you can do is you can give them a scenario. So I would be like, hey, the person eats a meal, it increases their blood glucose. This causes insulin release, and the insulin causes cells to suck up that excess glucose. And I would ask them then, like, which feedback is this? Is it positive or negative? And you can do this in a couple ways. Way one, you've got it written on your whiteboard like this, and your students just put post-its on what they think the right answer is. This is like low-tech crowdsourcing, right? Um, or you could have your students, because we kind of want them to do it at the same time so they're not copying each other, crumple a piece of paper and throw it. Now, remember, my class is really early in the morning, so this is a way to get them to stand up and do something physical. So it's really good if the students are falling asleep. By the way, you can also do it with multiple choice questions if you just want them to get up. The nice thing is students will inadvertently throw at the wrong thing just because they're bad at throwing. And then you can say, well, it looks like most of you think this. Why would it not be this? And then we can have that conversation. Or you could have students write their answer and hold it up on a piece of paper, or a lot of times I give my students a laminated like note card and they can hold it up, or you could even do colored note cards. You could do, green for positive and red for negative, and sort of just, we're going to read this scenario now. You're going to tell me what it is. And you could go through a bunch of different scenarios, both positive and negative, and you could also make sure that some of them are not hormones. So I'm seeing that Jacob says that he tells students that negative feedback negates small changes in homeostatic variables. Yeah, absolutely. And with mine, I always try to get them this idea of it's going to bring it back to center. We want to be in center. And we actually play a game that teaches them that. It's kind of fun. So you might think about, what about multi-step pathways? Well, one of the models I really wanted to show you, because it's one of my favorites and it's a little on the newer side, is the hypothalamic pituitary axis. And this is like your other visible body models. It's an interactive. You can actually draw on it. So one thing I do a lot of times with my students, I actually don't do PowerPoint anymore. I'll put up a model like this and I'll draw on it and make my notes as I'm talking to them. I can rotate the model, I can dissect it down, and then I can even share it as a note card with the class if that's what I would like to do, to make sure that they kind of have an idea of like what's what. And you can add typed notes. In this case, I was working on my computer. It's really nice if you do things on the iPad because the Apple Pencil works well. In addition, you've got this figure, and I learned that, guess what you can do? You can turn the text off on a figure. Now this is something you can put in an exam. You can tell the students, pick one of these organs and work on it. We're going to like remake the figure. You can now turn this, now that it's kind of naked, into an activity that your class could do, and turn into you, which is kind of fun. All right. In addition to that, I know a lot of people, when they think active learning, they're case study people. They love a good case study. This is where you use that Pathologies app. There's a ton of stuff in it, and there's a lot to choose from. So one example is there's this Addison's disease pathology. So you could have the students look at normal, and maybe you could have a table that's like, what is the normal sequence? And then have a table saying what has changed with Addison's, and then another table, how is this different from secondary? How is it different from tertiary? And you could kind of have each set look at their own thing, start to answer their questions, and then what you would do is bring them together to create a full class discussion. All right. So one thing that I would do is give everybody normal, but then say, here are these three cases. How does your case differ from normal? Now we can talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary. And what we can do is even go one step further and talk about, where would a medicine have to act to work on this condition and help this person get back to homeostatic balance? In addition to that, the Addison's one isn't just Addison's, it's actually Addison's and Cushing's. So that's kind of fun. So you could also have a team Cushing's that is now in here, and you could ask them, what's the difference between Addison's and Cushing's? Look at this, tell me where the problems are. And now let's talk about how that dysfunction is different. One thing I do with my students is I actually have them use the app, and I'll have them explain with the app. So they actually have to draw on it, they have to rotate it, and they turn in, if I'm doing asynchronous, videos to me that I can look at. So you'd have each team basically take a part, they figure out their part, and they talk about those pathologies and how to deal with them. One thing that I kind of mentioned is that my students do a lot of, we do a lot of video work, and it's because they're nursing students. And I'm like, you've got to explain complicated stuff to like mere mortals. So why don't you practice on me? And your goal is plain language. And so I have them submit me videos. You could have them do a pamphlet. And I've done this before as well, where the students have to make a pamphlet about a disease. Again, several pathologies to choose from. One of the ones I had to show off here is this really gnarly pancreas. This is in immersive, and it actually walks you through the pathology, or not in immersive, sorry. This is one of the interactives, and it walks you through the pathology step by step, even down to what the immune cells are doing. And this could be something, if you wanted to, if you introduced it to a group, you could actually bring it up again when you've got immune. Hey, do you remember that? What happened with those immune cells? What were they doing? Okay. I don't want to forget the ladies. One of my, oh yeah, there's a comment about infographics are always great. And I love having students make infographics. I also have mine make memes sometimes. And that's like a real quick and dirty. Students love making memes and short videos, and it's a good way to pep them up, especially if you're right before a break and they're kind of exhausted. I didn't want to forget about the ladies. We've got this beautiful ovary model, and the ovary model takes you through the different steps in ovulation. So kind of at this point, you've been through the feedback loops, you've learned some basic hormones. Now let's look at how they interact. And I always love it when my male students look at this and they're like, girls are complicated. Yeah, we are. And there's some other graphics that go along with this, one for pregnancy and one for just regular ovulation that you can use to kind of tease out what hormones are involved in which step. Okay, so I'm going to show you immersive labs. And immersive actually has within it an endocrine organs and what they do. And the cool thing about immersive is that you can edit these, and you can even add in external resources. So if you wanted to add in like a Google Doc that's collaborative that you wanted the students to work on, it could even be that chart that we gave you. You could do that, and you could have them work on it as part of their part of what they're doing. Each activity is its own thing. And once they're in immersive, they don't have to leave immersive. So they'll have activities, they'll have quizzes. And if they come back to it, it'll be kind of pick up where you left off, sort of thing. Again, you can still rotate these around and interact with them in a number of different ways. Don't ask me why I selected the putamen. I was just playing around with immersive and having a good time. And it keeps stepping them through. This particular one takes them through those different endocrine organs and what they do. And it even divides it into primary and secondary in a way that's just kind of interesting and helps the students to think about these things and capitalize on their curiosity by being able to click on stuff while they're doing it. All right. And the nice thing too is it's got quizzes at the end of each one. All right, cell signaling is also part of this, and I'm looking at the clock and I'm like, oh my gosh, is time really running out? It is. Cell signaling is also part of this. One of the things I love to teach my students is I love to teach them that if you don't have the receptor for the hormone, you're like not going to react to it. Their video called Endocrine System Hormones does that. There are also videos on water soluble and lipid soluble hormones, and those allow you to look through the different ones. And if you're like me and you teach about carrier proteins and you teach about how these things interact with the membrane and also how they interact in the cell, this gives you a really good way to do that. I'll admit in my class, sometimes because students will get confused and they're like, well, but the phospholipid membrane is both like polar and non-polar. So like, why is it such an issue for fats? Sometimes we will put a balloon on your back and make you put your arms out, and these are your fatty tails. And you notice really quickly that those fatty tails, when they line up together, are a lot longer than the balloon on the back. So we can shimmy past that balloon, but getting through those fatty tails is really hard. And that's a way to get them to see that you want those lipid soluble hormones to be able to make it through the membrane. But if it's water soluble, it can't because it's got to get to the lipid area. All right, there we go. So I want to go back to our learning objectives and look at how we did. And what I'm seeing is we got into positive and negative. We talked a little bit about diseases and pathologies and kind of how these imbalances are created. You can also look at drugs and how drugs interact with the system. I always love as one of my like end game things to teach how birth control works. And the nice thing is you can do this on every system and bring it up over and over again. A lot of times people teach homeostasis with endocrine, that's very late, but I actually like to teach it way up with cell signaling. And then we can revisit it on every system and we can talk about the homeostatic balance of each and every system and how that happens. Interactions of endocrine with other body systems, yeah. We started to get into that as well a little bit. And we got into pathologies that override it. Here are specific examples that you could use as you're looking at these things and as you're thinking about what examples am I going to use in my class. So I think we got a lot of these. And with that, I think what I would like to do with our remaining little bit here is turn it over to y'all and find out like, what are your ideas? What are the things that inspire you? What are things that you do?
And remember, feel free to use the raise hand feature if you want to actually unmute your microphone and have a dialogue.
So sometimes one thing we'll do is we'll give our students like sort of alien examples because I like to have them do things that are not Googleable, right? So what if I give you an alien example, or what if I give you a new drug? And those can be really fun because then you can make up new like positive feedback scenarios that are really weird. Um, and that's always a good time. Sometimes we talk about how would you develop a drug that. And one of my favorite examples, we do it pretty late in the year, but we'll teach female ovulation, and then we'll talk about where birth control works, and we'll talk about, well, what if you made a male birth control? Where would that work? And now it just reaffirms that same cycle that students are already learning. Oh, excellent. So Mariana is new to Visible Body. Um, Courtney, what other language is it available in? I know I saw a couple.
Yes, so visible body courseware, which Cindy had shown with the immersive assignments, is in English, but Visible Body Suite, which has all of the 3D models and animations and interactives, is available in 6 other languages besides English. Spanish is one of them. And you can change the language right in the app.
Cool.
So the other languages, in case anybody's curious, Spanish, French, German, simplified Chinese, Japanese, Italian. Was that 6?
Yes.
Spanish. Yes. Okay.
I think we forgot English. So yeah, I mean, it's one of the things my students like is that it even has buttons on how to pronounce. So I teach a lot of students that are English language learners, and anatomy and physiology is a language, right? And so for them to pronounce it, having that little button that they can push on anything and say, how do I pronounce it? It gives them a little more command. Like they feel better because they can actually learn those pronunciations. Have I taught with virtual rats? Oh, no. I'm not familiar with virtual rat. I moved on to the different visible body models ages ago. I think 2016 is what Courtney said. And we've been really using it a lot since then. I will admit that Courtney, cover your ears. You too, Nicole. I always look at what's out there because I think it's important as an instructor to look at like what other things can we use. And I have to admit to enjoying that visible body is more intuitive than what I find a lot of the other products to be. I feel like a lot of the others, you see this thing and it's beautiful, but you don't really know what to do with it. And this one is really nice in terms of empowering you as an instructor to make whatever visuals you want for your exams, for your lectures, to lecture with models. You can do all kinds of stuff. And when you assign things to students, it's really clear to them what they need to do to get through them, as opposed to some of the other ones that have a little less text. I view this more like an interactive textbook, and that's how we use it. And they do have animal models too. There's a pig and a starfish and a worm and a frog. I teach patho with nursing students, and I'm PowerPoint Lite. Awesome. Lots of diagramming and exemplar case studies. Yeah, absolutely. They don't always relate to AI conversion to podcasts and practice questions. So I guess one of the things that I do is I do a lot of diagramming as well with my students. What I like about this is it'll give them images that they can use in different things. So I don't do podcasts, but I do videos where they have to teach video or teach through a video. And the students are able to use the models and dissect them and kind of talk their way through it as if they are teaching it. And that's been a really powerful tool for me. As far as coming up with questions, you can create quizzes in Visible Body that are like, find the organ that does this thing. And then the student has to look through the model. Or, this pathology is happening. What's malfunctioning? And you can have them find things within the model. So I find it gives me a lot of different ways to ask questions, and in in-person classes, a lot of different ways to generate images so that I can have the students label things. I can have them interact with that material in different ways. And I'm not just pulling, whatever static 2D image that whatever publisher gave me. I can actually have like, I don't know, other organs in the way. And that's an exciting piece. So hopefully that answered your question.
I did want to quickly plug something that Dr. Harley had done a couple of years ago, a different webinar about moving beyond kind of, your,
Oh,
usual exams and different ways that you can assess student learning. And this was another webinar, and I am posting the link in the chat. You can find all of our previous webinars on our YouTube channel, but I felt this one was very apropos. And I think you guys will get some excellent ideas from
yeah.
this.
So I forgot what Courtney was getting at for a second there, and I'm going to share this. So I have my students, instead of exams, they make comics. This is an example of one. This is a digital example. They can hand draw them. I don't care. And some of them use visible body images, and that's fine too. They just have to add things to it. But this example is the student talking about, how things pass through cell membranes. And I've been doing this for a while, and what I like about it is that it is, I don't want to say AI proof because I don't know that anything is anymore, but at least for now, I don't worry about them cheating through AI because the level for which they'd have to prompt it is actually really difficult to get right. So they end up creating these things, and one of the things I tell them is your brain is It's not a computer, it's more of an attic, and sometimes the grill supplies and the holiday supplies are next to each other, and that makes no sense. And you have to organize your attic. And when you have it organized, that's when that information is going to be accessible and you're going to be able to find what you need when you need it. And so we talk about this as organizing the attic. And they're really pretty too. I'm a much happier grader when I grade those.
All right, so it is 3 o'clock, and if anybody has any last questions, now is the time. Um, and if you have questions that crop up, after this webinar has ended, Cindy has always been wonderful about sharing her contact information. I know that other instructors from previous webinars have reached out to you, and to bounce ideas off of you, and to share some of the things that they've been doing in their classes. So Cindy has posted her email in the chat, but I'm also going to hand it, or it's going to be part of the little kit that I'm going to send out to you tomorrow, which will include some of the goodies that Cindy showed today, some of the activities and ideas, along with that chart for the hormone relay activity. So be on the lookout for that tomorrow. I will be sending it via email. Oh, we have one late breaking question.
Oh, how do students create a digital example for the comics? Those are my students that have iPads. Of course, not everybody does, right? And that's okay. So some of them use paper and kind of, let's see, they'll literally do it by hand. I had one student, I'm actually going to see if I can post this in the chat. Nope. Denied. I had one student that would sort of create note cards of the individual ideas, and I'm going to try to share my screen again. I can show you this. And then she would kind of link the ideas together based on what she could put on the note cards. And again, this is, if you think about it like organizing your thought process, this was this student's way of organizing their thought process around these different things. So they can use paper and pencil, and that's just fine. But a lot of them, especially my A&P students, because Visible Body works really well on the iPad, a lot of them have the iPads and they'll just sketch it out on their iPad, and that works just fine